The application of humanist psychoanalysis to Marx's theory. Erich Fromm, 1965 cm. Marxism is humanism, and its aim is the full unfolding of man's potentialities, not man as deduced from his ideas or his consciousness, but man with his physical and psychic properties. The real man who does not live in a vacuum but in a social context, the man who has to produce in order to live. It is precisely the fact that the whole man, as well as his consciousness, is the concern of Marx's thought which differentiates Marx's materialism from Hegel's idealism, as well as from the economistic, mechanistic deformation of Marxism. It was Marx's great achievement to liberate the economic and philosophical categories that referred to man from their abstract and alienated expressions, and to apply philosophy and economics ad hominem. Marx's concern was man, and his aim was man's liberation from the predomination of material interests, from the prison his own arrangements and deeds had built around him. If one does not understand this concern of Marx, one will never understand either his theory or the falsification of it by many who claim to practice it. Even though Marx's main work is entitled Capital, Das Kapital, this work was meant to be only a step in his total research, to be followed by a history of philosophy. For Marx, the study of capital was a critical tool to be used for understanding man's crippled state in industrial society. It is one step in the great work which, if he had been able to write it, might have been entitled On Man and Society. Marx's work, that of the young Marx as well as that of the author of Capital, is full of psychological concepts. He deals with concepts like the essence of man, and the crippled man, with alienation, with consciousness, with passionate strivings, and with independence, to name only some of the most important. Yet, in contrast to Aristotle and Spinoza, who based ethics on a systematic psychology, Marx's work contains almost no psychological theory. Aside from fragmentary remarks on the distinction between fixed drives, like hunger and sexuality, and flexible drives which are socially produced, there is hardly any relevant psychology to be found in Marx's writings or, for that matter, in those of his successors. The reason for this failure does not lie in a lack of interest in or talent for analyzing psychological phenomena. The volumes containing the unabridged correspondence between Marx and Engels show a capacity for penetrating analysis of unconscious motivations that would be a credit to any gifted psychoanalyst. It is to be found in the fact that during Marx's lifetime, there was no dynamic psychology that he could have applied to the problems of man. Marx died in 1883. Freud began to publish his work more than 10 years after Marx's death. The kind of psychology necessary to supplement Marx's analysis was, even though in need of many revisions, that created by Freud. Psychoanalysis is, first of all, a dynamic psychology. It deals with psychic forces, which motivate human behavior, action, feelings, ideas. These forces cannot always be seen as such. They have to be inferred from the observable phenomena, and to be studied in their contradictions and transformations. To be useful for Marxist thinking, a psychology must also be one which sees the evolution of these psychic forces as a process of constant interaction between man's needs and the social and historical reality in which he participates. It must be a psychology which is from the very beginning social psychology. Eventually, it must be a critical psychology, particularly one critical of man's consciousness. Freud's psychoanalysis fulfills these main conditions, even though their relevance for Marxist thought was grasped neither by most Freudians nor by Marxists. The reasons for this failure to make contact are apparent on both sides. Marx is continued in the tradition of ignoring psychology. Freud and his disciples developed their ideas within the framework of mechanistic materialism. which proved restrictive to the development of the great discoveries of Freud and incompatible with historical materialism. In the meantime, new developments have occurred. The most important one is the revival of Marxist humanism. Many Marxist socialists in the smaller socialist countries especially, but also those in the West, have become aware of the fact that Marx's theory is in need of a psychological theory of man. They have also become aware of the fact that socialism must satisfy man's need for a system of orientation and devotion, that it must deal with the questions of who man is and what the meaning and aim of his life is. It must be the foundation for ethical norms and spiritual development beyond the empty phrases stating that good is that which serves the revolution, the workers' state, historical evolution, etc. On the other hand, the criticism arising in the psychoanalytic camp against the mechanistic materialism underlying Freud's thinking has led to a critical re-evaluation of psychoanalysis, essentially of the libido theory. Because of the development in both Marxist and psychoanalytic thinking, the time seems to have come for humanist Marxists to recognize that the use of a dynamic, critical, socially oriented psychology is of crucial importance for the further development of Marxist theory in socialist practice. That a theory centered around man can no longer remain a theory without psychology if it is not to lose touch with human reality. In the following pages I want to point to some of the principal problems which have been dealt with or which ought to be treated by humanist psychoanalysis. 1. The first problem which should be dealt with is that of the social character. The character matrix common to a group, nation or class, for instance, which determines effectively the actions and thoughts of its members. This concept is a special development of Freud's character concept, the essence of which is the dynamic nature of character. Freud considered character as the relatively stable manifestation of various kinds of libidinous strivings, that is, of psychic energy directed to certain goals and stemming from certain sources. In his concepts of the oral, anal, and genital characters, Freud presented a new model of human character, which explained behavior as the outcome of distinct passionate strivings. Freud assumed that the direction and intensity of these strivings was the result of early childhood experiences in relation to the erogenous zones, mouth, anus, genitals, and aside from constitutional elements, the behavior of parents was mainly responsible for the libido development. The concept of social character refers to the matrix of the character structure common to a group. It assumes that the fundamental factor in the formation of one. Unfortunately, there are so few authors who have attempted to apply revised psychoanalysis to the problem of Marxism and socialism that I must refer mainly to my own writings since 1930, cf. especially The Dogma of Christ, Psychoanalytic Characterology and its Relevance for Social Psychology, in The Crisis of Psychoanalysis, Escape from Freedom, The Sunday Society. Marx's concept of man, beyond the chains of illusion, deals explicitly with the relationship between the theories of Marx and Freud. Among other writers writing from a psychoanalytic Marxist standpoint, the most important is Wilhelm Reich, even though there is little in common between his theories and mine. Sartre's attempts at developing a Marxist-oriented humanist analysis suffers from the fact that he has little clinical experience and, on the whole, deals with psychology superficially, even though in brilliant verbiage. The social character is the practice of life as it is constituted by the mode of production and the resulting social stratification. The social character is that particular structure of psychic energy which is molded by any given society so as to be useful for the functioning of that particular society. The average person must want to do what he has to do in order to function in a way that permits society to use his energies for its purposes. Man's energy appears in the social process only partly as simple physical energy, laborers tilling the soil or building roads, and partly in specific forms of psychic energy. A member of a primitive people, living from assaulting and robbing other tribes, must have the character of a warrior, with a passion for war, killing, and robbing. The members of a peaceful, agricultural tribe must have an inclination for cooperation as against violence. Feudal society functions well only if its members have a striving for submission to authority, and respect and admiration for those who are their superiors. Capitalism functions only with men who are eager to work, who are disciplined and punctual, whose main interest is monetary gain, and whose main principle in life is profit as a result of production and exchange. In the 19th century, capitalism needed men who like to save. In the middle of the 20th century, it needs men who are passionately interested in spending and in consuming. The social character is the form in which human energy is molded for its use as a productive force in the social process. The social character is reinforced by all the instruments of influence available to a society, its educational system, its religion, its literature, its songs, its jokes, its customs, and, most of all, its parents' methods of bringing up their children. This last is so important because the character structure of individuals is formed to a considerable extent in the first 5 or 6 years of their lives. But the influence of the parents is not essentially an individual or accidental one, as classic psychoanalysts believe. The parents are primarily the agents of society, both through their own characters and through their educational methods. They differ from each other only to a small degree, and these differences usually do not diminish their influence in creating the socially desirable matrix of the social character. A condition for the formulation of the concept of the social character as being molded by the practice of life in any given society was a revision of Freud's libido theory, which is the basis for his concept of character. The libido theory is rooted in the mechanistic concept of man as a machine, with the libido aside from the drive for self-preservation, as the energy source, governed by the pleasure principle. The reduction of increased libidinal tension to its normal level. In contrast to this concept, I have tried to show, especially in Man for Himself, that the various strivings of man, who is primarily a social being, develop as a result of his need for assimilation of things and socialization with people, and that the forms of assimilation and socialization that constitute his main passions depend on the social structure in which he exists. Man in this concept is seen as characterized by his passionate strivings toward objects, men in nature, and his need of relating himself to the world. The concept of the social character answers important questions which were not dealt with adequately in Marx's theory. Why is it that a society succeeds in gaining the allegiance of most of its members, even when they suffer under the system, and even if their reason tells them that their allegiance to it is harmful to them? Why has their real interest as human beings not outweighed their fictitious interests, produced by all kinds of ideological influences and brainwashing? Why has consciousness of their class situation and of the advantages of socialism not been as effective as Marx believed it would be? The answer to this question lies in the phenomenon of the social character. Once a society has succeeded in molding the character structure of the average person in such a way that he likes to do that which he has to do, he is satisfied with the very conditions that society imposes upon him. As one of Ibsen's characters once said, he can do anything he wants to do because he wants only what he can do. Needless to say, a social character which is, for instance, satisfied with submission is a crippled character. But crippled or not, it serves the purpose of a society requiring submissive men for its proper functioning. The concept of the social character also serves to explain the link between the material basis of a society and the ideological superstructure. Marx has often been interpreted as implying that the ideological superstructure was nothing but the reflection of the economic basis. This interpretation is not correct, but the fact is that in Marx's theory, the nature of the relation between basis and superstructure was not sufficiently explained. A dynamic psychological theory can show that society produces the social character, and that the social character tends to produce and to hold on to ideas and ideologies which fit it and are nourished by it. However, it is not only the economic basis which creates a certain social character which, in turn, creates certain ideas. The ideas, once created, also influence the social character and, indirectly, the social economic structure. What I emphasize here is that the social character is the intermediary between the socio-economic structure and the ideas and ideals prevalent in a society. It is the intermediary in both directions, from the economic basis to the ideas and from the ideas to the economic basis. The following scheme expresses this concept: economic basis, social character, ideas and ideals. The concept of social character can explain how human energy, like any other raw material, is used by a society for the needs and purposes of that society. Man, in fact, is one of the most pliable natural forces. He can be made to serve almost any purpose. He can be made to hate or to cooperate, to submit or to stand up, to enjoy suffering or happiness. While all this is true, it is also true that man can solve the problem of his existence only by the full unfolding of his human powers. The more crippled a society makes man, the sicker he becomes, even though consciously he may be satisfied with his lot. But unconsciously he is dissatisfied, and this very dissatisfaction is the element which inclines him eventually to change the social forms that cripple him. If he cannot do this, his particular kind of pathogenic society will die out. Social change and revolution are caused not only by new productive forces, which conflict with older forms of social organization, but also by the conflict between inhuman social conditions and unalterable human needs. One can do almost anything to man, yet only almost. The history of man's fight for freedom is the most telling manifestation of this principle. The concept of social character is not only a theoretical one lending itself to general speculation. It is useful and important for empirical studies, which aim at finding out what the incidence of various kinds of social character is in a given society or social class. Assuming that one defines the peasant character as individualistic, hoarding, stubborn, with little satisfaction in cooperation, little sense of time and punctuality, this syndrome of traits is by no means a summation of various traits, but a structure charged with energy. This structure will show intensive resistance by either violence or silent obstructionism. If attempts are made to change it, even economic advantages will not easily produce any effects. The syndrome owes its existence to the common mode of production which has been characteristic of peasant life for thousands of years. The same holds true for a declining lower middle class, whether it is they which brought Hitler to power, or the poor whites in the South of the United States. The lack of any kind of positive cultural stimulation, the resentment against their situation, which is one of being left behind by the forward-moving currents of their society, the hate toward those who destroyed the images which once gave them pride, have created a character syndrome which is made up of love of death necrophilia, intense and malignant fixation to blood and soil, and intense group narcissism. The latter expressed in intense nationalism and racism. Point to one last example. The character structure of the industrial worker contains punctuality, discipline, capacity for teamwork. This is the syndrome which forms the minimum for the efficient functioning of an industrial worker. Other differences, dependence independence, interest indifference, activity passivity, are at this point ignored, although they are of utmost importance for the character structure of the worker now and in the future. The most important application of the concept of the social character lies in distinguishing the future social character of a socialist society, as visualized by Marx, from the social character of 19th-century capitalism, with its central desire for possession of property and wealth, and distinguishing it from the social character of the 20th century, capitalist or communist, which is becoming ever more prevalent in the highly industrialized societies. The character of Homo consumens. Homo consumens is the man whose main goal is not primarily to own things, but to consume more and more, and thus to compensate for his inner vacuity, passivity, loneliness, and anxiety. In a society characterized by giant enterprises and giant industrial, governmental and labor bureaucracies, the individual, who has no control over his circumstances of work, feels impotent, lonely, bored, and anxious. At the same time, the need for profit of the big consumer industries, through the medium of advertising, transforms him into a voracious man, an eternal suckling who wants to consume more and for whom everything becomes an article of consumption: cigarettes, liquor, sex, movies, television, travel, and even education, books, and lectures. New artificial needs are created and men's tastes are manipulated. The character of Homo consumens in its more extreme forms is a well-known psychopathological phenomenon. It is to be found in many cases of depressed or anxious persons who escape into overeating, overbuying, or alcoholism to compensate for the hidden depression and anxiety, the greed for consumption. An extreme form of what Freud called the oral receptive character is becoming the dominant psychic force in present-day industrialized society. Homo consumens is under the illusion of happiness, while unconsciously he suffers from his boredom and passivity. The more power he has over machines, the more powerless he becomes as a human being. The more he consumes, the more he becomes a slave to the ever-increasing needs which the industrial system creates and manipulates. He mistakes thrill and excitement for joy and happiness and material comfort for aliveness. Satisfied greed becomes the meaning of life, the striving for it a new religion. The 2cf the detailed discussion of this point in the Fromm, The Heart of Man, its genius for good and evil. Freedom to consume becomes the essence of human freedom. This spirit of consumption is precisely the opposite of the spirit of a socialist society, as Marx visualized it. He clearly saw the danger inherent in capitalism. His aim was a society in which man is much, not in which he has or uses much. He wanted to liberate man from the chains of his material greed so that he could become fully awake, alive, and sensitive, and not be the slave of his greed. The production of too many useful things, Marx wrote, results in the creation of too many useless people. He wanted to abolish extreme poverty, because it prevents man from becoming fully human. He also wanted to prevent extreme wealth, in which the individual becomes the prisoner of his greed. His aim was not the maximum but the optimum of consumption, the satisfaction of those genuine human needs which serve as a means to a fuller and richer life. It is one of the historical ironies that the spirit of capitalism, the satisfaction of material greed, is conquering the communist and socialist countries which, with their planned economy, would have the means to curb it. This process has its own logic. The material success of capitalism was immensely impressive to those poorer countries in Europe, in which communism had been victorious, and the victory of socialism became identified with successful competition with capitalism within the spirit of capitalism. Socialism is in danger of deteriorating into a system which can accomplish the industrialization of poorer countries more quickly than capitalism, rather than of becoming a society in which the development of man, and not that of economic production, is the main goal. This development has been furthered by the fact that Soviet communism, in accepting a crude version of Marx's materialism, lost contact, as did the capitalist countries, with the humanist spiritual tradition of which Marx was one of the greatest representatives. It is true that the socialist countries have still not solved the problem of satisfying the legitimate material needs of their populations, and even in the United States 40% of the population is not affluent. But it is of the utmost importance that socialist economists, philosophers, and psychologists be aware of the danger that the goal of optimal consumption can easily change to that of maximal consumption. The task for the socialist theoreticians is to study the nature of human needs to find criteria for the distinction between genuine human needs, the satisfaction of which makes man more alive and sensitive, and synthetic needs created by capitalism which tend to weaken man, to make him more passive and bored, a slave to his greed for things. What I am stressing here is not that production as such should be restricted, but that, once the optimal needs of individual consumption are fulfilled, it should be channeled into more production of the means for social consumption such as schools, libraries, theaters, parks, hospitals, public transportation, etc. The ever-increasing individual consumption in the highly industrialized countries suggests that competition, greed, and envy are engendered not only by private property, but also by unlimited private consumption. Socialist theoreticians must not lose sight of the fact that the aim of a humanistic socialism is to build an industrial society whose mode of production shall serve the fullest development of the total man, and not the creation of homo consumens. That socialist society is an industrial society fit for human beings to live in and to develop. There are empirical methods which permit the study of the social character. The aim of such study is to discover the incidence of the various character syndromes within the population as a whole and within each class, the intensity of the various factors within the syndrome, and new or contradictory factors which have been caused by different socio-economic conditions. All such variants permit an insight into the strength of the existing character structure, the process of change, and also what measures might facilitate such changes. Needless to say, such insight is important in countries in transition from agriculture to industrialism, as well as for the problem of the transition of the worker under capitalism or state capitalism, that is, under alienated conditions, to the conditions of authentic socialism. Furthermore, such studies are guides to political action. If I know only the political opinions of people as ascertained by the opinion polls, I know how they are likely to act in the immediate future. If I want to know the strength of psychic forces, which at the moment may not yet be manifest consciously, such as, for instance, racism, war or peace-mindedness, such studies of character inform me of the strength and direction of the underlying forces which operate in the social process, and which may become manifest only after some time. 3. There is no space to discuss in detail the methods that can be used to obtain the character data mentioned above. What they all have in common is avoidance of the error of accepting ideologies, rationalizations for expressions of the inner, and usually unconscious, reality. One method which has proved to be very useful is that of an open-ended questionnaire, the answers to which are interpreted as to their non-intended or unconscious meaning. Thus, when one answer to the question, "Who are the men in history whom you most admire?" is Alexander the Great, Nero, Marx, and Lenin, and another answer is Socrates, Pasteur, Marx, and Lenin, the inference is made that the first respondent is an admirer of power and strict authority, the second an admirer of those who work in the service of life and who are benefactors of mankind, by using an extended 3. Thus, for instance, the destructiveness present in the German lower middle class became manifest only when Hitler gave it the opportunity to express itself. Projective questionnaire. It is possible to obtain a reliable picture of the character structure of a person. 4. Other projective tests. The analysis of favorite jokes, songs, stories, and observable behavior, especially the small acts so important for psychoanalytic observation, help in obtaining correct results. Methodologically, the main emphasis in all these studies is on the mode of production and the resulting class stratification, on the most significant character traits and the syndromes they form, and on the relationship between these two sets of data. With the method of stratified samples, Whole nations or large social classes can thus be studied by including less than 1,000 persons in the investigation. Another important aspect of analytic social psychology is what Freud called the unconscious, but, while Freud was mainly concerned with individual repression, the student of Marx's social psychology will be most concerned with the social unconscious. This concept refers to that repression of inner reality which is common to large groups. Every society must make every effort not to permit its members, or those of a particular class, to be aware of impulses which, if they were conscious, could lead to socially dangerous thoughts or actions. Effective censorship occurs, not at the level of the printed or spoken word, but by preventing thoughts from even becoming conscious, that is, by repression of dangerous awareness. Naturally, the contents of the social unconscious vary depending on the many forms of social structure: aggressiveness, rebelliousness, dependency, loneliness, unhappiness, boredom, to mention only a few. The repressed impulse must be kept in repression and replaced by ideologies which deny it or affirm its opposite. The bored, anxious, unhappy man of today's industrial society is taught to think that he is happy and full of fun. In other societies, the man deprived of freedom of thought and expression is taught to think that he has almost reached the most complete form of freedom, even though at the moment only his leaders speak in the name of that freedom. For this method was first applied by myself together with Dr. E. Schachtel. There can be no alienation in a socialist country. In some a socioanalytic study, in some systems, there can be no alienation. In some systems, love of life is repressed and love of property is cultivated instead. In others, awareness of alienation is repressed, and instead the slogan, "There can be no alienation in a socialist country," is promoted. Another way of expressing the phenomenon of the unconscious is to speak of it in the terms of Hegel and Marx, that is, as the totality of forces which work behind man's back while he has the illusion of being free in his decisions, or, as Adam Smith put it, economic man is led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. While for Smith this invisible hand was a benevolent one, for Marx, as well as for Freud, it was a dangerous one. It had to be uncovered in order to be deprived of its effectiveness. Consciousness is a social phenomenon. For Marx it is mostly false consciousness, the work of the forces of repression. 5. The unconscious, like consciousness, is also a social phenomenon, determined by the social filter, which does not permit most real human experiences to ascend from unconsciousness to consciousness. This social filter consists mainly of language, logic, and social taboos. It is covered up by ideologies, rationalizations which are subjectively experienced as being true, when in reality they are nothing but socially produced and shared fictions. This approach to consciousness and the repression can demonstrate empirically the validity of Marx's statement that social existence determines consciousness. As a consequence of these considerations, another theoretical difference between dogmatic Freudian and Marxist-oriented psychoanalysis appears. Freud believed that the effective cause for repression, the most important content to be repressed being incestuous desires, is the fear of castration. I believe, on the contrary, that, individually and socially, man's greatest fear is that of complete isolation from his fellow men, of complete ostracism. Even fear of death is easier to bear. Society enforces its demands for repression by the threat of ostracism. If you do not deny the presence of certain experiences, you do not belong, you belong nowhere, you are in danger of becoming insane. Insanity is, in fact, the illness characterized by total absence of relatedness to the world outside. Marxists have usually assumed that what works behind man's back and directs him are economic forces and their political representations. Psychoanalytic study shows that this is much too narrow a concept. Society consists of people, and each person is equipped with the potential of passionate strivings. From the 5. It is interesting to note that Marx used the term repression, Verdrängung, in the German ideology. Rosa Luxemburg spoke of the unconscious, the logic of the historic process, coming before the conscious, the subjective logic of the human being, in Leninism and Marxism. Recently published in English in The Russian Revolution and Leninism or Marxism, most archaic to the most progressive. This human potential as a whole is molded by the ensemble of economic and social forces characteristic of each given society. These forces of the social ensemble produce a certain social unconscious, and certain conflicts between the repressive factors in given human needs which are essential for sane human functioning, like a certain degree of freedom, stimulation, interest in life, happiness. In fact, as I said before, revolutions occur as expressions of not only new productive forces, but also of the repressed part of human nature, and they are successful only when the two conditions are combined. Repression, whether it is individually or socially conditioned, distorts man, fragments him, deprives him of his whole humanity. Consciousness represents the social man determined by a given society. The unconscious represents the universal man in us, the good and the bad, the whole man who justifies Terence's saying, "I believe that nothing human is alien to me." This incidentally was Marx's favorite motto. Depth psychology also has a contribution to make to a problem which plays a central role in Marx's theory, even though Marx never arrived at its satisfactory solution. The problem of the essence and nature of man. On the one hand, Marx, especially after L844, did not want to use a metaphysical, unhistorical concept like the essence of man, a concept which had been used for thousands of years by many rulers in order to prove that their rules and laws corresponded to what each declared to be the unchangeable nature of man. On the other hand, Marx was opposed to a relativistic view that man is born a blank piece of paper on which every culture writes its text. If this were true, how could man ever rebel against the forms of existence into which a given society forces its members? How could Marx use, in capital, the concept of the crippled man if he did not have a concept of a model of human nature which could be crippled? An answer on the basis of psychological analysis lies in the assumption that there is no essence of man, in the sense of a substance which remains the same throughout history. The answer, in my opinion, is to be found in the fact that man's essence lies in the very contradiction between his being in nature, thrown into the world without his will and taken away against his will, at an accidental place and time, and at the same time transcending nature by his lack of instinctual equipment and by the fact of his awareness, of himself, of others, of the past and the present. Man, a freak of nature, would feel unbearably alone unless he could solve his contradiction by finding a new form of unity. The essential contradiction in man's existence forces him to seek a solution of this contradiction, to find an answer to the question which life asks him from the moment of his birth. There are a number of ascertainable but limited answers to the question of how to find unity. Men can find unity by trying to regress to the animal stage, by doing away with what is specifically human, reason and love, by being a slave or a slave driver, by transforming himself into a thing, or else by developing his specific human powers to such an extent that he finds a new unity with his fellow man and with nature by becoming a free man, free not only from chains but free to make the development of all his potentialities the very aim of his life. A man who owes his existence to his own productive effort. Man has no innate drive for progress, but he is driven by the need to solve his existential contradiction, which arises again at every new level of development. This contradiction, or, in other words, man's different and contradictory possibilities, constitutes his essence. To sum up, This article is a plea to introduce a dialectically and humanistically oriented psychoanalysis as a significant viewpoint into Marxist thought. I believe that Marxism needs such a psychological theory, and that psychoanalysis needs to incorporate genuine Marxist theory. Such a synthesis will fertilize both fields.